Hi. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Hi, Beth, and everyone in our audience. Welcome to our webinar, which we've called Crafting Climate Futures from Story to Policy. And it's an event that is prompted by, perhaps inspired by, you could say, the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, which certainly for the purposes of this event, we're seeing as, not just an opportunity to take decisive policy action, but a call really to create narratives of positive climate futures. The event is presented by the Olaf Stapledon Centre for Speculative Futures at the University of Liverpool, in collaboration with the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. I'm Adeline Johns-Putra. I'm a professor of literature at Xi'anjiaotong, Liverpool University in China. But really, I want to hand over, introduce to you our panel. All our panelists are involved with the Climate Imagination Fellowship Program, which is hosted by Arizona State University. The program brings together talented fiction authors from around the world, combining their talents with thoughts provided by researchers, policy thinkers, community members to imagine positive climate futures that are grounded in real science, but also in local particularities and the complexities of specific geographies, physical and social geographies. And all the stories and the essays that come out of the fellowship will explore how to use narratives to catalyze climate action in the present and to advocate for climate justice. The fellowship is supported by the Climate Works Foundation. It involves partnerships with, to just name a few, the UN High-Level Champions for Climate Action, TED Countdown, the British Library, and others. Let me introduce now our panelists one by one. We have Vandana Singh, who is an author of speculative fiction. She's a professor of physics as well at Framingham State University and an interdisciplinary researcher on the climate crisis. She's the author of 2 short story collections, The Woman Who Thought She Was a Planet and Ambiguity Machines. Her work on a justice-centered approach to the climate crisis is part of a forthcoming volume from UNESCO. And she was brought up in New Delhi and now lives in Boston. Welcome also to Hannah Onoguri, who is a writer of fiction and nonfiction based in Yenagoa in Nigeria, in the southern state of Bayelsa. This is a region famous for its oil industry. Hannah is the author of the short story collection Cupid's Catapult, and her work has been published in the anthology Africa 500 and the periodicals Ominana and Brittle Paper. Hannah is the winner of the Association of Nigerian Authors Poetry Competition. We have Xia Jia, who's a speculative fiction author and associate professor of Chinese literature at Xi'anjiaotong University. 7 of Xia's stories have won the Galaxy Award, which is China's most prestigious science fiction award. Xia is the author of the novel Odyssey of China Fantasy, On the Road. She's also written an academic volume, Coordinates of the Future, Discussions on Chinese Science Fiction in the Age of Globalization, and 4 short fiction collections, most recently, A Summer Beyond Your Reach. And finally, Kim Stanley Robinson. Stan Robinson, the New York Times bestselling novelist and winner of the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards. Stan has published more than 20 books, including, I'm sure you all know, the Mars Trilogy, Green Earth, New York 2140, and most recently, The Ministry for the Future. In 2008, he was named a Hero of the Environment by Time magazine. He works with the Sierra Nevada Research Institute and the Clarion Writers Workshop, lives in Davis, California. So welcome, all of you. We're going to start with, or run this webinar as a series of provocations and questions from writers, editors, and academics working in climate, environment, and culture. What we'll do as we move through the webinar is play each of these questions, or as you will realize, provocations as well. Perhaps we could call them provocative questions or questioning provocations. And they're really meant to get our writers and panelists thinking. And we'll play each of them one by one, and we'll open up to our panelists to respond. Our first provocation comes to us from Graham McDonald, who is Professor of Literature at the University of Warwick in England, but he's also, as you will hear, as soon as he starts speaking, a very proud Glaswegian. And he has questions not just about climate fiction and petroculture, but his question takes us right to the heart of Glasgow. So let's hear from Graham.
Hey everyone, I'm Graham McDonald, Professor in Literary Studies at the University of Warwick. It's good to be asked to do this, and to Kim Stanley Robinson in particular, thanks for all the pleasure your back catalogue has given me and my students over the years. My question is short, but as a Glaswegian I can't resist some local illustrating. If it's the case that climate breakdown interrupts all protocols of fiction writing, reading and criticism and turns them to future making, and if it's the case that elements of climate policy making, much like the IPCC's SSPs, form a kind of speculative narrative genre, then how do we balance the weight of the past on all of this future envisioning? As we continue to reproduce many aspects of our long petroculture, doesn't everything within it become climate fiction? That pension fund you joined in 1990, the gas you filled the tank with in 1977, it all keeps coming back to say hello. COP has highlighted Glasgow and Scotland's own deep and long carbonising legacy, from the thermodynamists of the 19th century to the ongoing era of North Sea oil. In a recent work of notable climate fiction, a guilt-ridden survivor of a horrific heatwave in Asia finds himself on a bridge, looking down at a river and a city in some dark fantasy. The bridge is in Glasgow, the river is the Clyde, around which the conference is taking place, and the novel, of course, is The Ministry for the Future, where Glasgow seems to offer some form of escape from climate trauma, some potential recuperation, a cooling effect. But even as it appears a radically different space in the novel, the worsening events elsewhere hang over it. So how much should the business of looking ahead and repairing the future be informed by looking back? Look not far downriver, now, past the old shipyards, and you'll find the UK's first modular water source heat pump for district heating. Great implemented policy. But turn back, and about 2 miles upriver lies the site of James Watt's 1765 Eureka moment, named by some as a signal event in global heating. Do we Glaswegians then, and the rest of you moderns, feel the weight of this legacy enough? Fiction offers a useful place to hold discordant spaces and times in simultaneous play. Does policy making? Must writing climate futures necessarily accommodate such histories as part of that future, or underwrite them? Maybe they're all just water under the bridge in an emergency. Thanks.
Well, I guess that's a big question about how we reconcile our past carbon lives with, if you like, our future speculations for carbon neutral future. There's a lot there. How do we look back as we craft these futures, craft these narratives of the future and look forward? Indeed, as Graham asks, do we have to? Shea, Vandana, Hannah, Stan, who would like to craft a response first?
How about I go second?
Vandana says she'll go second. Stan, you're right there in Glasgow. Hannah, yep, Hannah, please go.
Okay, I just wanted to say that I think every bit of learning, whether it's past, I think is very important and relevant. I think the idea is that we're supposed to learn something, maybe avoid some mistakes. And probably when we have disasters behind us, we try not to repeat them. So going forward, I think at this point in time, when he was talking about is everything going to be climate fiction from here on? I think in some sense, because it's like every part of our lives. If it's not about the actual ecological disasters that exist and some of us have to live with, is the fact that some of the products and things we use have to change. And I think all those are going to have they're going to be featured in fiction, just as maybe before the first cars came, when you have the transition from horseback riding to carriages to cars. I think it's just part of, I think there are not subtle ways to infuse all of those. You don't want to be preachy really, but I think it's all going to be part of growing here on out. So I think we can't ignore it or act like it doesn't exist. Hopefully it's going to help us learn, and hopefully it's going to help us make better choices in the future. I think in every aspect of life.
Vandana, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think that this question actually goes to the heart of what the whole climate policy and fiction and all of this is all about to me. And because what I see is an enormous wall or boundary of the imagination, whether it's in the context of climate fiction or in the context of what I've so far seen of COP26 or the TED countdown. And this wall comes from a lack of acknowledgement of the past, in part, in the sense that we live within paradigms, and the dominant paradigm of modern industrial civilization is this mechanistic worldview. And it's also based on colonialism. So the past is a kind of shackle to the imagination. And if we don't first recognize that our imaginations are shackled, we are not going to be able to throw it out. Maybe I'll elaborate later on, but I think that this question is really important.
So as Hannah says, learn from the past, and embedded in that is the idea of confronting the past. And as you say, yes, you can't get rid of that. You confront it in order to release yourself from the shackles of whatever mistakes have been made in the past.
Yeah, and yes, I just totally agree with that. We need to confront our past, and also at the same time, we need to, I think it's to develop a way of like a critical thinking to reflect on our past, right? We cannot just repeat the traditional narration of all of this, like the conquers, the developments we achieved in the past, but we need to think about what's wrong inside of all of these ground narrations. So I think that what's interesting that Jeremy just mentioned that within the current frame, all the fiction can be regarded as like a fiction, a climate fiction, I've heard a very similar saying. I think it was when I was in the US, when I was as a visiting scholar at UCR. I attend it's called like a Speculative Future of Education conference, and one of the participants suggests that all of our education in this age should be like a ecological education. And if we do not involve with this kind of issue, it should not be like a proper education, or like maybe education in a bad way. So I just think about an interesting thing is that this semester I'm giving a course called Science Fiction and Imagination. And I think it's interesting to share all of this, like some of the very classical science fiction narrations with my students, but encourage them to reread the story in a comparatively like a critical way to find out the problems. For example, when let's say when I mentioned, I compared the war between the War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells and the Martin trilogy by Stanley Robinson, and I told my students to just imagine that one day the Martin invaders come to the earth and they just spread the red weeds of the Martin red weeds over all of the earth. And so from our point of view, that's a horrible thing. So just change your mind to think about our imagination of our colonialization of the alien planets, for example, the Mars. We are also thinking about, for example, to grow the green weeds of in the Mars and to change the environment. And I think that's a very crucial, like a critical approach provided by Stanley Robinson to, like, I think it's a challenge to like old-fashioned, more like colonialized style alien planet romance, to think about that what we should do not before and after we really have this ability to go to other planets to like expand our civilization. Yeah, so I think education to the future generation is very important. Yeah, thank you.
Well, you're moving from what Hannah said and Vandana said, you've got to, another bit of Graham's question, which is, yes, we're learning from the past and confronting it, absolutely. But Graham was also asking about climate crisis as a kind of interruption of all elements of fiction making and confronting the past in that way as well. So so all three of you have moved us towards this possibility of using older grand narratives, as you put it, Shia, reinventing those narratives, not just grand ideological narratives, but ways of telling those stories. Science fiction stories of colonization, for example. How can we use those in a time of climate change and rethink them? And because you mentioned Martian trilogy, and because we're talking about colonization and kind of maybe more conventional science fiction or classic science fiction, I think that's the way to put it. Let's move to Stan and Stan's response.
Sure, thank you, Adeline, and thank you, Graham, for your question. This presence of the past, what Marx once called the dead hand of the past, it definitely weighs on us, and it can't be dismissed out of hand, because we live in a nation state system and we live in global capitalism, and the era of explicit colonialism has been replaced by a kind of a neo-colonialism of everybody by way of the neoliberal capitalist order that means that every person alive is subaltern to capital. So that's the system that we're in, but we have a climate emergency on the planet, a biosphere collapse that's going to hit within these next 10 years are crucial. Let's put it that way. We're already in it. So there's no time to dismiss the dead hand of the past and invent some more suitable, liberated utopian system to cope. We actually have to use the already existing system to solve a problem that system has in large part created. So this is what I'm seeing in Glasgow, where I am right now. At COP26, there were people struggling to figure out how to use current tools of the nation state system by way of international treaties, but also, crucially, trying to use capitalism to continue to make a profit while curing the ills of capitalism's exploitation of the biosphere and of people. It's awkward. The intensity of the negotiations within the rooms where they're negotiating it is muted, but nevertheless there. And I'm thinking now that the solutions, now that what I've described sounds really like a fatal paradox or an impossible crux. we're going to have to dig into the past again for solutions that we can apply immediately, which is to say Keynesianism. The governments are going to have to take over finance and the markets. And as they did in the moment of the Depression and World War II, they're going to have to bite the bullet, seize the economy, and aim it at rapid decarbonization and biosphere health. Some people here see that. Some people are trying to use government priming of the pump to drag private capital along behind it, as in the Mark Carney plans. It's a moment of confusion as they try to reinstate a more Keynesian view of how government and business mixes as a kind of desperate fix, I think, to get us to dodge the mass extinction event that's coming down on us now.
So, yeah, actually, it's really kind of coming to terms with, or really rethinking or going back to ideas about government intervention. That's, I think, a point that will come up in a later question and provocation. We'll certainly be going back to governance. But the next provocation really moves us very nicely into, very neatly into this problem of confronting the past and confronting what Vandana called the shackles of the past. And this is a question that comes to us from Chinelo Onwalu. And and I should say, before we go on to Chinelo's question, for the audience, I mean, if your mind is racing as much as mine is with all kinds of questions, there's a Q&A button where you can submit queries, and we hope to have time to come to those too. But let's go to Chinelo's question. We will certainly want to talk about governance and intergovernmentality, but we'll go to Chinelo now, who's got a question about climate justice and decolonization.
This question comes to us from our friend and colleague Chinelo Onwalu, a fiction author, editor and communications consultant based in Toronto, Canada. Chinelo is co-editor of Anathema magazine and co-founder of Omanana, a magazine of African speculative fiction. She asks the panel the following question. How would you effectively decolonize the fight for climate justice? Currently, many proposed solutions and ideas are coming from the world's wealthiest nations and are expected to be applied wholesale to poorer ones. Plus, they do little to redress historical wrongs and are often hinged on resource-heavy technological innovations that will continue to perpetuate inequality. For example, electric cars whose batteries require massive amounts of heavy metals mined from the most exploited areas of the world. So, how do we decenter the Western gaze as we work towards more sustainable futures?
How do we decenter the Western gaze as we work towards more sustainable futures? Again, I'm happy to hand over to Shia, Vandana, Hannah, Stan, who would like to begin with a response? Vandana?
I'm about to say, I hope it's not like a pattern that I go first all the time.
I promise I won't just jump out at you next time, Hannah.
Okay, I'm thinking, Chinelo mentions a kind of wholesale. It's the kind of, there's this idea that there's a one size fits all. And in as much as there's a science behind it, I think it's important for everyone to get on board or to be put on board. There's a need for inclusivity, and I remember among ourselves, fellows, I think we remember talking about a lot of indigenous ways that some are lost. I think if ways are not documented, there are actually records of people long before climate change became a thing, of how things were done. I remember Vandana talking about ways of cooking certain things, which the installation would cook the rest of the way. And I think there are a lot of answers in some of these traditions. Unfortunately, especially I'm talking from my end, they may not be documented, and a lot of people who have the knowledge might not be alive anymore. But I think it's important that, another panel we had, someone saying that it's the more you talk about this and learn, the more you realize that nobody knows everything. And that's a humbling thing, that everyone has something to bring to the table, to the conversation. So it's important that, okay, yes, maybe the finance is coming from a certain quarter, but it doesn't mean that the victims, the people who suffer the most, should shut up and just, sit back and wait for them to apply all the science and findings. And, you have to have conversations, and you have to bring people in. So people feel have a sort of stake in what's going on. Now, just like Cha talked about education, we do a lot of these things in English, and some people don't know what is going on. So it's also important to get the local languages involved, interpreted, okay, what is going on, so that even the 70-year-old, 80-year-old in the village, when they come she understands what is happening, and it's not just, oh, they are coming, they are doing so and so, and then most of the people who are actually involved are kind of lost. So the importance there, I think, is to get everybody on board, whatever way, let the solutions also come from, okay, how do we do this? What do you think? And not just like that, apply one balm for everybody and you think it's going to work. That's what I think.
I heartily agree. I heartily agree with Hannah here. I think that it's really, really, really important to realize, firstly, that, and this is to speak to something that Stan said earlier, it's not as though there aren't those ideas there already. It isn't as though we have to sit and think about them. They are there. The reason that most of us don't know about them is because of colonialism, neo-colonialism, colonialism, whatever you want to call it, because the global North has essentially colonized the imagination as well as everything else. And so the ideas, the concepts, the paradigms that we all think of as our default are actually things that have come up from the global North and been imposed on the rest of the world. And what I see happening right now is a continuation of that. And one of the things we must acknowledge is hegemony, that yes, I agree reluctantly in part that we have to use the tools of capitalism to shift the ship from its course, where it's going over the cliff, over the waterfall, at least to a limited extent. But the people at COP26, the people at TED Countdown, they're not talking about using it to a limited extent and then exploring other paradigms. They're talking about saving capitalism before actually looking at saving the planet, the biosphere, and various species, including our own. So hegemony is something that has to be acknowledged. And the second thing, that, as I said, is that there are already ideas out there, as Hannah said, that it's not as though, we have to sit and think of them. I mean, maybe people in the West have to sit and think of them, or people like us, who are relatively privileged. But the ideas are out there. And there are two ways that you can think about climate justice. And here's how I see the dominant structures, including well-meaning people at the UN conference and at TED and other such, relatively elite top-down bodies, is that let's make spaces to include the voices of indigenous people and people. Let's make spaces. So let's keep our structure intact, but find nooks and crannies to where we can have these voices, as opposed to looking at the structure itself and saying that this is screwed. And let's see what alternative structures and possibilities are there. And I'll just mention a couple of things that are already happening. There are people coming up with the idea of a pluriverse. There are people coming up with the idea of post-development. There's the global tapestry of alternatives. There is a Vikalp Sangam project in India, where people, and these are all so-called ordinary people, are coming up with and actually working out ideas and living these, what you might call utopias in one sense. And these are grassroots people who are forced to do this because their backs are against the wall. And what I'm saying is, of course, we need large scale infrastructure changes. We need all those top-down things to happen. But if they're not informed by what's happening at the grassroots, what's happening bottoms up, then we are lost. And one more thing I want to quickly point out is that the idea of time itself, talking about how things are viewed differently in different parts of the world. The idea of time itself is a slippery concept. When we invoke the linear time narrative that, I as a physicist am perfectly familiar with, but also as a theoretical physicist, I know that time is slippery, time is relative. But that aside, I just want to point everyone's attention to a remarkable essay by an indigenous scholar in the United States at the University of Michigan, Kyle White. His essay is called Time as Kinship. And that acknowledges the urgency of the problem, but talks about how we must think differently about time and takes various Native American perspectives on how to tell the climate crisis as a series of broken relationships rather than as linear time. And then see from that paradigm, that context, what emerges. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, decolonizing the imagination with some of the imaginative structures in our stories, including the temporal structures, is what you're saying. Kind of basically introducing new ideas to tell stories, new ideas to experience, moving us away from hegemonic neoliberal structures that have colonized our imaginations. I'll just repeat for anyone who missed it, Kyle Powys White and his essay Time as Kinship, right? That was what Vandana was talking about. Yeah, and Stan.
Yeah, so just to follow the previous order that, I think, just as Vandana talked about, when we talk about, for example, the Western gaze, I think the thing is not such simple, like like a binary opposition, like the West and the East, but like I think it's always like the imbalance between the developed and the developing regions. And I think the crucial issue is it's not just simply like which group of people should take the larger responsibility for the climate change or something, but we really need to be very cautious about this, like, so how to say, like linear thinking that, for example, there is always be a solution while our development, just while this, the current approach, and there always be, we should not stop, and we should to blame the, for example, to conclude the main cause to the, for example, undeveloped method. So to give a very exact example is that I think it was in 2008 in China, there's a journalist who made and released a documentary on the smog issue in China. And even though that the journalist herself raised up like the two major causes of the smog, which is gasoline and the coal. But as the documentary released, the major audience of this documentary, which are largely like middle-class people, they denied that the use of the increase of private cars are the very important cause of the smog issue. They denied that, and they blamed, they focus on the second cause and said because of the large countryside in China, the people there, they are still using the very, for example, the dirty energy, the dirty resource like coal, and they even burn the fireworks to keep warm during the winter. So they should to develop in like a faster pace to resolve this question, and there will always be like a economic solution. So I think in the following years, when some of the news report that some of the local government, they just forbid the use of the furnace in countryside to to meet the requirements of the like the reduce of the smog. Many of the middle class audience readers do not empathize with this issue, and they think that those people, they just deserve that, and we just that's even though some people think that they are very feel sad for them, but they think that must be the only proper way to resolve this problem. So I think we really need to reflect on this like the structure of method. Yeah, that's it.
I'm happy to add to this, agreeing with all of the other commenters. And I'm thinking that back to the question itself, it's not, the Western gaze is a phrase out of academia, but really it's power and money. It's Western money. It's the developed world that has exploited its colonies in previous centuries, and that process continues on an individualized level, leaving us with developed countries that have powerful money and loads of capital, and developing countries where are the people that are going to get hammered first by climate change and have already been exploited in the first place. So it's a dark situation from which to try to deal with climate change, a difficult one. And I take Van Dana's point. It's a little bit disappointing in a situation like that to merely be recommending Keynesian economics out of the 20th century as a solution. But I'm thinking that given where we are and that this decade is crucial, we have to use the tools that we have with the hope that later that would lead to social democracies and democratic socialism as being the more just system that we need to invoke as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, we have to work with what we've got. And because I am at Glasgow, I'm again going to focus on COP26. And indeed, the Paris Agreement, one of its best achievements, signed on to by 198 countries, is climate equity. And really, a lot of people threw their careers into that section of the Paris Agreement, that climate equity is built into the deal and everybody signed off on it. The developed nations need to do more to help the developing nations get clean energy and rise out of poverty in the same moment that we're creating a decarbonized world. Now, this is one of the difficulties here. And indeed, everybody should look at how things turn out as to whether they manage to write a proper Article 6, which deals with climate equity issues. It's being fought out in the negotiations, and one of the interesting things for me is that I've been given a badge that allows me to go right into the negotiating sessions as an observer and watch, and it is intense between exactly the developed nations that don't want to give away any money. It's as if capital and money have a kind of gravity, and the more you've got, the harder it is to give any of it away, even though you don't need it. And even though your own long-term health depends on giving it away in intelligent ways to help out the people who don't have it. So that's remarkable to watch, the unfortunate heavy gravity of money when it's collected. But the deal being made here is the best chance that we have for international diplomacy to do it instead of sheer power, meaning guns in your face. So I think the process here is important. I think there is actually a written plan for enormous amounts of capital. And really, I think the need is in the nature of a couple of $1 trillion per year, every year, being generated by the capital intensive nations of the West and distributed out as the Paris Agreement requires to the developing nations for rapid deployment of clean energy and health measures. Now, whether that will happen, promises are made and then they're broken. And that, since Paris, there has not been a whole lot of progress on promises that were made at Paris, even though one of the promises was we're going to keep getting better. So the stress is enormous. And the story isn't yet out. A week to go on COP26. At the end of that week, people will have to begin to unpack the story, what really did happen there. And then will people hold to the promises that they made? It'll be an ongoing struggle that won't go away.
We could go on to a provocation next, but I wondered if anybody wanted, I don't know if you wanted to jump in with more thoughts, or we could go on to our next question.
If I can just say briefly, I do acknowledge the importance of COP26, but I think that where I am, I find myself more with the protesters in one sense, although some of the, so I also have a pass that allows me to attend some sessions, although in the middle of a hectic teaching semester, it's very difficult. But there have been some voices within COP as well who are trying to see things differently. But when it comes to the high level negotiations, I think it's pretty much, sounds like the framework is business as usual. So to go back to Chinello's prompt, I think that one kind of justice we don't acknowledge is epistemic justice. The fact that ways of thinking and concepts that are useful to us or perhaps crucial for us to get out of this mess are, arise from the global south and aren't heard about and aren't acknowledged because of the dominance of the global north. So I'll just end with this piece because I don't want to hold up the event, that I think that at least imaginative fiction, there's a role for it. There are a couple of roles. One is that you can take the current scenario and try to extrapolate and, and so on and so forth. And that's totally fine and important, in fact. But there's another place that where it can play a role, which is where it can crack open the imagination to these other possibilities that may seem remote right now. But we know that history is not a monotonic sequence of events. We know that there are disruptions in history. So I feel like imaginative literature, at the very least, should not be shackled by some of the things that we are talking about.
Okay, well, we'll go to, there seems to be a kind of contrast here, or, hopefully a kind of healthy contrast between the narratives going on at COP and the kind of grassroots imaginative, the stories that we're also talking about. This provocation takes us back to intergovernmental cooperation, and takes us back to some of the things that Stan's talking about, the best kinds of things that could come out of COP26. We're going to go to this one and see what our questioner Tobias Buckell has to say, and see what you all think of this question about intergovernmental cooperation. And it might get us thinking again about how we don't just talk, have cooperation between governments, but actually find a way to get some of those grassroots voices to come through. So let's go on to Tobias's question.
Hi, my name is Tobias Buckell. I'm a science fiction author. I was born in the Caribbean, so I've got a little bit of a taste of what heavy weather and climate change can bring to vulnerable communities. I've written 15 novels, some of which are up here, and 120 short stories. And my question is, when I grew up in the 1990s, a really amazing job was done on intergovernmental communication and cooperation to create cap and trade, which allowed us to heal the hole in the ozone layer. I hear a lot of talk about geoengineering these days, and one of the things that concerns me is that not just with mega projects that have an impact on the world, which I would assume need a lot of governments to come together and plan and cooperate with, which is exactly the same kind of cooperation that leads to something like cap and trade. I'm also wondering what regulatory carrots and sticks are being put into place with the agreements now, knowing that governments can come in and out now who may not be committed to continuing the progress of trying to lower the amount of carbon and heat that's put into the atmosphere. What kind of regulatory mechanisms are coming in that allow industries or force industries to sort of make some of the same decisions that they had to make during cap and trade in order to meet the goals of the previous global atmospheric changes? Be very curious to hear a conversation about that. Thank you very much for your time and taking my question.
Okay, that's a question very much about what mechanisms are available to us to, to create real intergovernmental cooperation. But I'd like to open that up and take us back to, policy and fiction. Open that up a little bit more to a broader question about how we write worlds in which such intergovernmental international cooperation is possible, psychologically and emotionally. But I'm going to throw that question out there.
Should I, can I, yeah, let me change up the order here. I'll go first and quickly. I want to say that being in Glasgow, I have actually been in 3 protest marches, and one of them was simply by accident, but it's been very inspiring to be out amongst the people, mostly Scottish people, but people from everywhere. And I think that it's really important to have that aspect of things remembered, demonstrated, enacted, because it keeps pressure on the political leadership not to be bought off by fossil fuel industries. Now, speaking of fossil fuel industries, about 75% of the fossil fuels on the planet are under national government control. They are not private industries. They are national resources, and those petrostates are going to have to be compensated, or else their citizens are going to go into a depression of unprecedented severity if we were to suddenly cut off fossil fuels, which we have to do. So there are a group of nations that include many very powerful ones and some less powerful, and of course Nigeria is one of them, where the economies that depend on selling their fossil fuels are going to need financial compensation to keep it in the ground. So this is a new thought coming out in this COP that hasn't appeared before. And just to finish very quickly, thanks Tobias, good to see your face. It seems to me that the Montreal protocols that were set up to deal with the chemicals that were destroying the ozone layer are exactly what has been reproduced in the Paris Agreement, but it's way harder to get rid of the fuel that drives the entirety of civilization than it is refrigerants. So hopefully, even at the bigger scale, we'll bring this same kind of success to the table.
Anybody else from the panel? Anna?
Since Sally mentioned Nigeria, let me also mention, I too am interested in how to make sure, what they do, what they say they will do. I think many times on other issues, we've had a history in my country of saying one thing and doing something else. And, sometimes there's a lot of whitewashing, a lot of activity on the surface, this committee, that committee. But when it boils down to actual action, we see very little. So for me, like he said, we have, for the oil and gas, I read recently, like about 86% of the national economy imports and exports. When that is taken away, it's like saying to someone here, like, how it's like a waste. So even when there's compensation, which is a great idea, how are we going to ensure that it is used for the people and not just like some other source of stream of income? Oh, there's money coming in here, and then the people are still suffering, nothing is being done. We have to create more industries, more job opportunities. Because for a regular person who is leaving the university, a lot of your goal is to work in an oil company, really, because it's a good paying job. So if you're saying that is off the table, what are the options? What are the ways that we are going to live well? We have energy issues already with power. How is it going to get better? So I would also like to see how, is there some way, maybe introduce whistleblowing? What are the consequences for not following up, for a nation? And would it be dire enough to make them do the right thing? I think that is what I'm also interested in.
Yeah. Would anybody else from the panel like to join in?
I'd like to comment as well, but yeah, if you want to go ahead first, that's fine.
Oh, just waiting for like the final chance. I want to try to tackle this question from maybe a different point of view. That I think, for example, I think the carbon coin suggested by Stanley Robinson in his novel, as well as like other speeches, is, for me, I think it's a very inspiring idea that we really need to develop a new system to evaluate the effects I think it's what his point here is public benefits, not for like economic growth. So we need to evaluate the collective as well as the personal behaviors, and it's like the effects on these public benefits. So which can provide us our opportunity to refresh our, how to say, like the criteria, the standard of to make choices. In my short story, which is included in 12 Tomorrows, published in 2020, I contributed a short story entitled The Monk of the Leaning Temple. So in that story, I imagined that a group of Buddhism monks in a temple, they developed a system, and its name is karma. So such system is developed based on the big data, but the purpose of this system is to provide a way to evaluate all of these behaviors, effects, to especially the negative behaviors to our public benefits, including our environment, the polluted nature, as well as like for example, the network environment. So all of this kind of things. So in my story, when people need to confront this system and to think how to, for example, to reduce their negative karma. So it's just like a very, very starting point. But the point is that the negative karma is always increasing. It's very hard to really to eliminate them or like purify them. But you need to recognize that just as our negative effects towards the environment, it's always increasing, and we need to think how can we like to take this responsibility, this duty, or even guilty to continue our everyday life and to reorganize our many aspects of our ordinary life. Yeah, so that's a maybe very idealist suggestion. Yeah.
Well, it's maybe a kind of response to one of the questions I asked, which is how do you write a world in which such cooperation is possible? I don't know that story, and I'm going to go straight to it, and I'd love to read it with Vandana's entanglement. Actually, read them against each other. Vandana, please go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for your comments. And I'm really excited by what Jia said, because I have also played with the idea of karma as a kind of, almost like a currency in a way. So that's really exciting, and I'm really looking forward to reading that story. So to comment on a couple of other things, like for instance, what Hannah said about, money flowing into countries like from the Green Climate Fund, say, to frog leap us over fossil fuels and so on. That, the problem is that what the global north essentially has done with the cooperation of the people in in power in the global south is to addict us all to the fossil fuels. And you can't simply get off of an addiction. You can't, just remove the tap and say you're going to be okay. You have to like do all kinds of interventions and so on. So I see that. And in fact, there's more and more, we know that, for instance, there's some recent work that the super rich themselves can blow the 1.5 C limit that we, the aspirational goal. And that just brings to an important point to bear here, that people within countries, so as Tobias said, we need to think about intergovernmental cooperation, but also people within countries are not monolithic, as we know, that the large proportion of carbon emissions and of the material footprint, which is a better indicator of ecological harm, actually is due to the rich in all the societies. So that's why there's the inequality within nations is also important to look at. And then again, to reiterate what Stan said, that yes, indeed, the Montreal Protocol, the ozone problem is a completely different situation in the sense that you had to hit upon one product. And here we are talking about something that fuels much of the world's civilization. So that's much, much harder.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Let's move to a question from Rebecca Sosi that takes us back to, I think it was Vandana who mentioned Indigenous peoples. And Rebecca asks us a question that takes us to that issue and to our exercises in imagination and the role of the Indigenous imagination in that. So could we hear from Rebecca Sosi, Professor of Law at Arizona?
My name is Rebecca Sosi. I'm a Regents Professor of Law at the University of Arizona, and I also serve as the faculty co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. I've written on Indigenous environmental ethics, Indigenous environmental self-determination, human rights, and the legal rights of Native peoples within domestic and international law. And the area that I really work in terms of climate policy is looking at the space that Indigenous peoples ought to occupy within our international and our national discourse. And I do that in the context of the assumption that we do live in a moral universe and that the instructions for living in that universe have been present with us since creation, and that Indigenous peoples upon their lands, upon their waters, are in many ways the best stewards and custodians of that past history that has enabled all of us to thrive and survive into the present day. Climate crisis is an existential crisis in many ways, but in the way that it threatens Indigenous peoples and their rights to live upon their traditional lands, it is unprecedented. If those lands disappear, for example, because they are swept away by rising oceans or flooding, where will the people go and what will they do? Who will they become? Those exercises of imagination are so important in the present world. And I commend you for this exercise into our positive climate futures, in which I would ask you to represent the whole fabric of our Indigenous peoples as they are represented on each continent in association with their lands from time immemorial, that intergenerational and spiritual context. How is that going to be protected within US and international climate policy? That may seem a challenge, but I look forward to the response, and that is the future of all of us and survival into the next century. Thank you so much. I appreciate this.
This will be our last provocation, and there may be time, if we extend to 10 or 15 minutes after, there may be time for some questions from the audience, but I'll leave Rebecca's question out there. Who Who would like to respond?
I could
Vandana?
start. Yeah. Well, firstly, I wanna say that Rebecca wrote a wonderful essay, and I'm going to put the link to it in the chat. That was for a project that I'm involved in, along with Center for Science and the Imagination and the University of Oslo, where we're bringing 5 writers from India, from indigenous and Dalit backgrounds, to write climate futures. So I've just put the link in the chat, and we have our first writer's story and also a response, a beautiful essay response from Rebecca. To her point about indigenous people, I want to point out a couple of things. One is that green technology and green energy also threatens indigenous cultures, because they are being displaced for things like wind farms and things like that as well. Those are also a threat. So that brings into question the role of, or rather that should prompt us to examine the role of technology and to recognize the fact that the socio-cultural economic context of technology matters just as much as the technology itself, but we are not used to thinking like that. We just look at a technology in isolation. And in fact, Kyle White in his essay talks about how green energy projects have been detrimental to indigenous peoples as well. So there's an entire justice issue there as well. So the other thing I want to point to is that in 2018, there was a report, I believe, from the Rights and Resources Institute that essentially looked at the amount of, well, a number of things, among which was the amount of carbon on which, in lands where indigenous people live. And what they concluded was that indigenous people, as we know, 5% of the world's population, protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. And also almost 300 million tons of carbon are managed in these places. So indigenous people's well-being is our well-being. And the report also pointed out that where they have land rights, that's where the forest cover and the landscape is the healthiest. So one easy way, easy in one sense, but to me, easy way to fix or to mitigate, one mitigation tool is simply to give land rights to indigenous people. But let me tell you, by contrast, what's happening at this moment in India as we speak, that the largest contiguous forest in central India, the Hasdeo Arand, is being razed down for, guess what, open cast coal mining. And the people who are protesting are the Adivasis, the indigenous people of that area. They went on a 300-kilometer foot march to the state capital, to no avail. So then they have gone to Delhi to try to push against what's happening. This is a place where there's multiple endangered species. There are elephants, tigers, bears, along with the people who have lived there, some of which have never seen anything outside a forest. So when we talk about net zero and things like that, those accounting tricks that you can hide a whole lot of things, and then that peculiar feature of modernity and neoliberal economics, that you can replace rich biodiverse forest and its peoples with some kind of a offset somewhere else. So the land becomes this abstract thing that can be commodified. That is a real problem. So that's one reason why in my stories I try to foreground these things as exactly for the reasons that Rebecca stated. And I feel like as speculative fiction writers, we do have the ability, if we work hard enough at it, to foreground voices that are not heard often enough or are misheard. So I'll stop there. Thanks,
Vandana. Anyone else on the panel like to, especially to Vandana's last thought, that as speculative fiction writers, you can try, and I think all of you have, bring some of those marginalized voices to the fore. Because I'm quite conscious that as we run out of time, that there's been such a full response to Rebecca's question. I'm actually, yeah, Stan.
Yes,
Maybe
I think I can.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
So Stan, you go first.
No, you go
Please,
first.
please.
Share,
Okay,
you go,
thank you.
and then Stan.
Yes, yes. Okay, so I think I can talk about this question, maybe not directly relates to like indigenous people, but has something to do with how can we have some like a consciousness about like the disaster happens to others, to other people, right? So I just want to take another like a teaching case in my class, that when I talked about the end of the world, I shared a very famous novel, Japan Sinks, by Japanese writer Saiko Komatsu. Yeah, so basically the plot of that novel is that because of Japan is sinking and it will sink into the ocean in like no more than 1 year. So the Japanese people need to think about how to evacuate the people. So there are like 3 options of the evacuation. So the first of all, to create a new country aboard, which is just largely impossible. And the second is to immigrate and integrate into other people, into other nations, which means that will know Japanese people. So the third is that to think with the homeland, just to like a suicide, or to accept the forthcoming destination. So I think what is interesting is that it's mentioned in the novel that international response to this disaster, that many people in other countries, they believe that, for example, Japan deserved this misfortune because of its behavior during the World War II. And it also mentioned like many Japanese people's attitude. So in my class, after I shared this question, I posed this question to my students that if that really happens, would you support or oppose to accept Japanese immigrants if they want to come to China? So of course, many Chinese people, especially the young Chinese people, they do not have this like great emphasis with the Japanese people. But after that discussion, then I shared another short story by Tsutsui Yasutaka. The short story's title is "The World Sinks Except Japan." So just to imagine that we would be the like immigrants and to find a place in Japan, and you need to encounter all of these sufferings. So if whether or not this imagination would like change your attitude towards the Japanese people. So I think, yeah, just as we discussed again, that speculative, how can we make use of the speculative literature as like a tool to create a better way of thinking for maybe a more possibility to resolve these questions. So that's my response. So next to Stan.
Yes, but I want to go. Yeah, I want to go quickly so that there's time for Hannah to also comment on this. I think it's important. I mean, as a person, I speak as the descendants of white settler colonials in Turtle Island. And so I have to try to think how to make space in my mental life and in the world for indigenous points of view for the people that have lived here for so long, the first peoples of my area. And in that project, I'm studying, I guess you would say, and listening to the Paiute and Monash peoples of the Sierra Nevada of California. Now, decolonialization is not a metaphor. This is a very important essay by Yang and Tucker. If it is true, and I think that they very much mean it's true, then that action in the world would be the taking on by modern civilization of indigenous attitudes towards the earth as a shared common, as a mother figure, as an extension of our body, and as a sacred space that we cannot wreck without damaging ourselves as well, so that it becomes an act of reverence to live within the biosphere limits that exist. So these are important, the lessons that I'm trying to take forward out of that realm of experience. And in my writing, I hope I can imagine the other as well as anybody. But in my life, it becomes a harder project to try to actually defend wilderness as an indigenous necessity for the wild creatures, to try to decolonialize cities and have indigenous attitudes to the commons where everybody lives now. And these are huge challenges, but interesting as such. They're, in effect, these are kinds of science fiction stories or speculative fictions that have entered mainstream thinking if we can make it happen.
Hannah?
Yes, talking about adequate representation wherever conversations are had. I was reading an article yesterday on how there's not a lot of space for indigenous voices in COP26. And with even travel restrictions and all that, I think it's important somehow going forward. I think thinking ahead to relaxing some of these, they're important really, stringent rules and regulations, but for the purpose of hearing people's voices and seeing them. I think it's important not just to have it, oh, they're somewhere out there, but actual listening to them, like what Stan just said. I think it helps to every person to become used to having others in your space. I'm also speaking for myself because when I write from a certain angle, it's like I'm other, it's like, but even within my country, we have terrorism in the north. And I'm just trying to imagine if, because of war and people have to move out of their villages, and am I going to open my arms to them? Am I not going to treat them with suspicion? Like, oh, you have come, you want to take over. Some of these things are not overt, but just getting used to having people in your space and treating them with kindness and empathy. It also leads us to think about migration, and if people want to enter a country, for instance, how are they going to be treated? I think refugees around the world generally are not treated well. There is no place like home, really, but seeing that we have these challenges ahead, can we actually have real plans and preparations for, okay, what if this happens and what if that happens? And what are actual policies and real plans being made to absorb people? Whether it's forever, we don't know, but to just cater for everybody and be sure that everyone is welcome to some extent. I think it's important to think ahead and plan, because it's going to happen and it's already happening. So instead of, people being treated as second-class citizens and longing for home, which they might never go back to for whatever reason, think of starting a new home and being being connected to that earth where you are, I think is important.
And actually some of that welcoming, some of that planning is an act of kindness to anticipate what is needed and to anticipate needing to welcome people. Can I now, those are the provocations we'll play for you, but I really want to, we don't have time probably for all the questions, but let's pick a couple from the audience and we'll end with quick responses from you to a couple of those. And perhaps start with a short question, one of the first ones. How do you all identify suitable large-scale climate solutions that could actually work to include in your stories? If you do this, that is. How do you think through large-scale climate solutions to apply?
Well, in my case, I do my research on Google first, and you see what's working elsewhere. Like in the story I wrote recently, this offshore windmills, because it's such a huge thing, and it was just really cheering to see the possibilities, it can cater for so many people. So there's no despair of, oh, there are no solutions, how are we going to get over it? People have been doing it, countries have been doing it. So it gives you that some kind of justification. It's happening. And even like Adeline said, there are other things coming up. If we keep our minds open and our imaginations open, there are a whole lot of solutions that could come up ahead, I think.
Andana?
I tend to kind of regard how these large-scale solutions are portrayed with a great deal of suspicion.
What's happening first.
Yeah. So I find, like for instance, it's very important to see who's pushing it, who's pushing these large-scale solutions, for whose benefit it really is, as opposed to purported benefits. And also the idea of large-scale solutions themselves. Like, the Earth is geographically diverse. So different kinds of solutions will work, technologically speaking, in different places. So the way I try to think of it is, what kind of a diverse tapestry of solutions could be integrated? And I also try to get away from sort of climate reductionism, because we also have biodiversity loss, we have land system use changes, and we have the nitrogen cycle imbalance as well, which you hardly ever hear about. So, when you look at these problems in an integrated way, then you must think about integrated solutions, and perhaps the solutions have to be as diverse as the planet itself, but integrated in a way that they actually make for global scale shifts. And so I go very carefully in this direction, and I always look at the context, the socio-economic, cultural context of the solution, whatever it is. And also I want to say that technology is not, solutions aren't just technological, they're sociological solutions as well, and we don't often pay attention to those. So I play with those as well.
Would anyone else share, or Stan like to jump in, or we could go to another question? Yeah. Stan?
Oh, I can just say very quickly, if you're writing a novel, the interesting thing is to try to examine, as Vandana put it, a tapestry of solutions in interaction, to see if you can get a new story out of that illuminates some of the problems and advantages of the different methodologies. Again, echoing Vandana, it isn't always silver bullets. It isn't always throwing dust up into the atmosphere. Women's rights worldwide, that's large scale, that's transformative of land use, energy use, population growth going forward. The more power women have in this world, the better off human civilization and the biosphere is. So that's you can talk about that as geoengineering and simply blow up the idea of geoengineering as being a silver bullet fix from Silicon Valley by making people rethink what a large-scale global transformation is in civilization. I think that's good. And then lastly, in short stories, you can take on one little thing, tell one moment, the way short stories are good at doing.
Shia, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, and speaking of the telling story, I think the tricky thing is that if you want to sell a welcome story, for example, the final solution, like a large scale solution, can be a very useful technique to make this story, for example, to give an imaginative solution in the final moment. So at the end of the world, one person just press a button and the series of mechanism system just activated, and then there's the large change. For example, I think for example, to transform or purify the atmosphere. But I think this is I mentioned, the old-fashioned or traditional narration we should at least to be cautious of. We cannot say we do not, we should abandon this kind of story, but we should encourage our, for example, readers to think about, to criticize, to think what's we neglect when we just so enjoy reading this kind of story. And if we want to think the issues deeper, we should also develop a different kind of reading, reading costume for some for example, more slow pace or complicated story. Yeah, so.
Thank you. Thank you all. There are loads of great questions being asked in the Q&A, but your responses, I think, are wide-ranging enough to be addressing a lot of those questions. There was a question there about heroism, and I think Stan and just saying, look, there are no silver bullets. There are heroes all over the place. All your answers have really ranged over enough ground, I hope, to answer not just one of those questions, but a few. So I'm going to have to wrap it up really reluctantly because this has been such a rich discussion. The provocations have, you've provoked right back, and that's been fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you to this wonderful panel, Shia, Vandana, Hannah, Stan. This has been a tremendously enriching discussion. Thank you so much for all your thoughtful responses.